The sound wasn't loud, but it carried, sharp enough to cut through laughter, champagne glasses, and polite applause, the kind of sound that makes an entire room forget how to breathe for a second. And in that second, everything changed. 200 guests stood frozen beneath crystal chandeliers in a Manhattan ballroom worth more than most homes in the city. And at the center of it all, Lily Caldwell didn't move, her hand resting instinctively over the gentle curve of her 7-month pregnancy. Her eyes steady, not shattered, not even surprised, just still, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment longer than anyone in that room could possibly understand. Ethan Caldwell lowered his hand slowly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, like nothing unusual had happened, like this was just another small disruption in a perfectly controlled life. And around them, whispers began, subtle at first, then spreading like a ripple across silk dresses and pressed tuxedos, because people like this never raise their voices, never create scenes, and yet here it was, a fracture in the illusion. A glass slipped from someone's hand somewhere to the left, shattering softly against marble, but no one looked away from Lily, because something about her silence felt louder than anything else in the room. This was supposed to be a celebration, a charity gala hosted by Caldwell Enterprises, the kind of night where reputations are polished, not questioned, where deals are made with smiles and handshakes, not tension and quiet stares. And yet the air had shifted, heavy now, charged with something no one could name yet, but everyone could feel. Lily blinked once, slow, deliberate, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, and when she finally lifted her gaze to meet Ethan's, there was no anger there, no tears, just a calm that didn't belong in a moment like this. A calm that made a few people in the crowd exchange uneasy glances, because they had expected a reaction, expected a scene, expected her to break, but she didn't. And somewhere near the stage, a photographer hesitated, finger hovering over the shutter, uncertain whether this was a moment to capture or pretend never happened, because moments like this don't stay hidden for long, not in a world built on image and perception. Ethan leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that only Lily could hear, but his expression remained perfectly composed for the audience watching, the performance never breaking, not for a second, and yet whatever he said didn't shake her, didn't move her, didn't do anything at all except confirm something she had already known. And then, almost imperceptibly, Lily's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not warm, not forgiving, just knowing. It was subtle, so subtle most people missed it entirely, but the few who noticed felt something shift again, deeper this time, like the ground beneath the evening had quietly given way, because that was the moment, not the sound, not the whispers, not even the stares, but that expression, that stillness, that unspoken understanding that what had just happened was not the end of anything, but the beginning of something far bigger than anyone in that room was prepared for. And as the music awkwardly resumed, as conversations tried and failed to pick back up, as the illusion of normalcy struggled to stitch itself back together, one truth settled quietly into the space between every heartbeat in that ballroom. Ethan Caldwell thought he had just controlled the situation, but in reality, he had just set something in motion that no amount of power, money, or influence would be able to stop. No one approached her for the next 30 seconds, and in a room filled with people who built empires out of timing and opportunity, that silence said more than any apology ever could. Lily Caldwell adjusted the thin strap of her evening dress with slow, measured precision, as if the world had not just tilted, as if the weight she carried beneath her heart mattered more than the opinions swirling around her. And then she took a single step forward, heels soft against polished marble, not retreating, not rushing, just moving with a calm that did not match the tension tightening across the room. Across from her, Ethan had already turned slightly, greeting a donor with a practiced smile, his voice smooth, controlled, the same voice that had secured million-dollar deals and quieted entire boardrooms. And yet even as he spoke, his attention flickered back to Lily, just once, quick enough that most would miss it, but long enough to reveal something rare, something close to uncertainty, because Lily was not reacting the way she was supposed to, and people like Ethan depended on predictable reactions, on control, on knowing exactly how the next move would unfold. A server passed between them carrying a tray of untouched champagne, the bubbles catching the light like fragments of something fragile, something temporary, and Lily reached out, not to drink, but to steady the glass for a brief second before letting it go again, her fingers lingering just long enough to remind herself that she was still grounded, still present, still in control of something even if the narrative around her had been written without her consent. Somewhere near the stage, Vanessa Blake let out a quiet laugh, the kind that tried to disguise itself as polite amusement, but carried just enough edge to draw attention. And when Lily turned her head slightly, their eyes met for the first time that night, not as strangers, not as rivals, but as two people who understood exactly what role the other was playing. Vanessa lifted her chin just a fraction, confident, composed, already claiming a space she believed was hers, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for Lily to acknowledge it, to challenge it, to break under it. But she did none of those things. Instead, Lily's gaze moved past her, beyond the carefully curated image, beyond the performance, as if she had already seen the ending of this story and found it unremarkable. A murmur rippled through a cluster of guests near the back as someone whispered a name, not Ethan's, not Vanessa's, but Lily's, spoken with a tone that carried curiosity instead of pity, because something about her presence did not align with the role she had been assigned, and people were beginning to notice. The music swelled again, louder this time, almost forced, as if the orchestra itself had been instructed to fill the cracks forming in the evening, and yet the rhythm felt off, just enough to make every movement in the room feel slightly delayed, slightly uncertain. Lily placed one hand lightly against her abdomen, feeling a gentle shift, a reminder that she was not alone in this moment, that every decision from here forward would echo beyond herself. And for the first time since the sound cut through the ballroom, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, carrying just far enough to reach Ethan without inviting the attention of the entire room. And what she said was not a demand, not an accusation, not even a question, just a simple sentence delivered with absolute certainty, the kind that does not ask for permission or validation, the kind that exists on its own terms. And when Ethan heard it, his smile paused for half a second too long, just enough to break the illusion he had spent years perfecting, because in that moment, he realized something he had not considered before, something no one had warned him about, something that could not be undone. Lily was not the person he thought he could control, and whatever came next would not follow the script he had written. The sentence Lily spoke did not linger in the air for long, but its effect did, settling into Ethan's expression like a crack beneath polished glass, invisible at first glance but impossible to ignore once seen. And as he turned fully toward her, excusing himself from the donor with a subtle nod, the distance between them felt larger than the ballroom itself, not measured in feet, but in something far more difficult to bridge. Lily did not wait for him to close that space. Instead, she moved past him with quiet certainty, her shoulder aligned, her gaze forward, not dismissing him, not acknowledging him, simply choosing a direction that did not include him anymore. And for the first time that evening, Ethan followed, not out of habit, but out of necessity, his steps slightly faster, controlled but no longer effortless. They reached the edge of the ballroom where the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, Manhattan stretching out in a grid of lights and ambition, a reminder of everything he had built and everything he believed he owned. And yet, standing there, with Lily framed against that skyline, something about the balance of power felt altered. "You are making this more difficult than it needs to be," he said quietly, his voice measured, as if this were a negotiation, as if there were still terms to be discussed. And Lily turned her head just enough to meet his eyes, her expression unchanged, calm, almost reflective, like someone observing a moment rather than living inside it. "Difficult," she repeated softly, as if testing the weight of the word, and then she let it go, her attention shifting back to the city beyond the glass, because whatever definition he was holding onto no longer applied to her. Behind them, the room continued its careful recovery, conversations resuming in fragments, laughter returning in uneven bursts, but a current of awareness remained, subtle and persistent, because people were watching, even if they pretended not to. And in rooms like this, perception was currency. Vanessa had moved closer. Now, not directly approaching, but positioning herself within view, her reflection visible in the glass beside Lily, a composed silhouette framed in confidence, waiting for an acknowledgement that still did not come, and that absence began to draw more attention than any confrontation could have. Ethan lowered his voice further, leaning just slightly closer, his tone shifting from persuasion to warning, reminding her of contracts, of expectations, of the life she was part of, the one that did not allow for unpredictability, the one that required alignment. And for a moment, there was a pause, a space where the old version of Lily might have responded, might have adjusted, might have agreed to keep the surface intact. But that moment passed quietly, without ceremony, and when she finally spoke again, her words were simple, steady, and entirely her own, not shaped by him, not softened for him, just truth delivered without emphasis, and it landed with more weight than anything raised in volume could have. "I remember everything," she said, not looking at him, not needing to, because this was no longer about convincing him of anything. It was about stating what already existed, and something in. Ethan's posture shifted, barely noticeable, a slight tightening, a recalibration, because memory meant evidence, and evidence meant consequence. And for the first time, the carefully constructed narrative of the evening began to feel unstable, not because of what had happened, but because of what might come next. Lily placed her hand gently against the glass, feeling the cool surface beneath her palm, grounding herself in something real, something unchanging, and in that quiet gesture, she made a decision that did not require an announcement, did not need validation, did not seek permission. Behind her, the music continued, the lights shimmered, the illusion held just enough to keep the night moving forward. But beneath it, something had already shifted, something that would not return to its original shape, no matter how carefully anyone tried to restore it. For a moment, neither of them moved, and the space between them felt suspended, like the city outside had paused just long enough to listen. Ethan's reflection hovered faintly beside Lily's in the glass. A man who had built his life on precision, now faced with something that did not follow rules, and he adjusted his stance again, subtle, controlled, but no longer effortless, because control required clarity, and clarity was slipping. "You are overthinking this," he said, quieter now, as if lowering the volume might restore order, as if tone could reshape reality. But Lily did not turn, did not respond immediately, and that delay, that silence, carried more weight than any argument could have, because it meant she was choosing her words, not reacting to his. Behind them, the orchestra shifted into a softer piece, something slower, almost reflective, and couples began to move again, gliding across the floor with careful elegance, pretending the evening had not fractured, pretending nothing had changed, but their eyes betrayed them, glancing, returning, measuring the distance between appearance and truth. Vanessa took another step closer, still outside the direct circle, her presence deliberate now, no longer waiting to be acknowledged but expecting it, her posture confident, her expression composed, as if the outcome had already been decided. And for a brief second, Ethan's attention flickered toward her before returning to Lily, a calculation happening behind his steady gaze, one that had always served him well until now. Lily exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that resets something internal, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the same calm certainty as before, but now there was something else beneath it, something grounded, something unshakable. "You built everything on appearances," she said, not accusing, not emotional, simply stating what was, and Ethan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, because truth delivered without force was harder to dismiss, harder to counter, harder to control. "This is not the place for this conversation," he replied, a final attempt to redirect, to contain, to move the moment somewhere private where it could be managed, reshaped, rewritten. But Lily shook her head slightly, not in defiance, not in anger, just in quiet refusal, because the location no longer mattered. The audience no longer mattered. The narrative had already shifted. The reflection in the glass captured all three of them now. Lily at the center, Ethan just behind her, and Vanessa to the side. A composition no one had planned, but everyone could see. And something about that image lingered, something that did not align with the version of events people had expected. Lily lowered her hand from the glass and turned fully this time, facing Ethan without hesitation, her posture steady, her expression composed. And for the first time that evening, there was no distance in her gaze, no softness, no hesitation, just clarity. "There is nothing left to manage," she said quietly, and the words landed with a finality that did not need emphasis, because they did not ask for agreement, they did not invite negotiation, they simply existed. A nearby conversation faltered, just for a second, as if the room itself had heard, and Ethan's response came a fraction too late, not because he did not have something to say, but because he was recalculating, adjusting to a version of events he had not prepared for. "You are not thinking about the consequences," he said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something beneath his composure, not fear, not yet, but awareness, the recognition that consequences were no longer his to define. Lily held his gaze for a moment longer, then let it go, not dismissing him, not conceding, simply choosing not to engage further. And that choice, that absence of reaction, shifted the balance again, because it removed the framework he relied on. Behind them, the music swelled, the lights shimmered, the evening continued its careful performance. But beneath it, something irreversible had already taken shape, something that would not be softened by time or hidden by silence, something that had begun the moment she chose not to play her role anymore. The words settled between them with a weight that did not need to be repeated, and for a brief moment, the entire evening seemed to hesitate again, like a carefully choreographed performance missing its next cue. Ethan's expression remained composed, but the precision in it had changed, the edges slightly sharper now, less certain, as if he were recalculating outcomes in real time and finding fewer variables he could control. And that realization did not sit well with a man who had built his entire life on predictability. "You are letting emotion guide you," he said finally, his tone returning to something measured, something almost instructive, as if this were still a discussion he could steer back into familiar territory. But Lily's gaze did not shift, her posture unchanged, her calm unbroken, and the absence of reaction forced the words to fall flat, unsupported, ineffective. Behind them, a group of investors resumed their conversation a little too loudly, laughter rising just enough to fill the silence. But it carried a different tone now, less genuine, more aware, because no one in that room was truly ignoring what had happened. They were simply choosing not to address it directly. Vanessa closed the remaining distance with quiet confidence, her heels soft against the marble, her reflection aligning beside Ethan's in the glass, completing the image that had already begun to circulate through the room without a single word being spoken. And when she finally spoke, her voice was smooth, controlled, carrying the practiced ease of someone accustomed to stepping into spaces that were not originally hers. "Perhaps this is not the right moment," she said lightly, her gaze directed toward Lily but her presence angled toward Ethan, as if positioning herself within the narrative rather than outside of it. And for a fraction of a second, Ethan allowed that alignment, allowed the illusion to settle, before shifting his focus back to Lily, because despite everything, she remained the center of what was unfolding. Lily studied Vanessa briefly, not with hostility, not with judgment, just with a quiet recognition that did not grant validation or challenge. And then she looked away, her attention returning to the city lights beyond the glass, because whatever role Vanessa believed she was stepping into did not require Lily's acknowledgement to exist. And that absence of reaction created a subtle imbalance that even Vanessa could feel. The music shifted again, the tempo slightly faster now, as if the room itself was trying to move forward, to escape the moment rather than resolve it. And couples adjusted, conversations resumed, but the energy remained uneven, threaded with a tension that refused to dissolve. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that signaled decision rather than uncertainty. And when he spoke again, his tone had changed, less persuasive now, more definitive, as if drawing a line he expected her to recognize. "We will discuss this later," he said, the words carrying an assumption of agreement, of continuation, of a future conversation that would restore order. But Lily's response came without hesitation, without delay, and without any need for emphasis. "There is no later," she said, her voice steady, her expression unchanged, and the simplicity of it stripped the statement of any ambiguity, leaving nothing to interpret, nothing to negotiate. A nearby guest turned slightly, just enough to catch the exchange without appearing obvious. And in that small shift, the awareness spread further, quiet but undeniable, because statements like that did not belong in rooms like this, not without consequence. Ethan's jaw tightened again, the smallest visible sign of disruption, and for the first time that evening, he did not immediately respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because the structure of the conversation had shifted beyond his control, and that absence, that pause, carried its own weight. Lily adjusted the fabric of her dress once more, a simple, grounding gesture, and then she stepped away from the glass, away from the reflection that had defined the moment, choosing a direction that did not include either of them. And as she moved, the space she left behind did not close, did not reset. It lingered, marking a divide that could not be undone by silence or time, because something fundamental had already changed, and everyone in that room, whether they admitted it or not, had felt it happen. She did not look back as she walked, and that was the part that unsettled the room the most. Not the distance itself, but the certainty in it, the absence of hesitation, the quiet finality of someone who had already made a decision long before anyone else realized there was one to be made. The soft rhythm of her heels against marble blended into the music, but to those paying attention, it sounded different, deliberate, measured, like each step marked a line being drawn that could not be crossed. Again, behind her, Ethan remained where she had left him, his posture still composed, his expression carefully neutral, but the stillness around him had shifted, no longer the stillness of control, but something closer to pause, like a system recalibrating after an unexpected disruption. Vanessa stood beside him now, her presence aligned, her confidence intact, yet even she could not ignore the subtle change in the room. The way attention followed Lily instead of settling where it was expected. The way conversations tilted slightly, just enough to acknowledge that something had moved beyond the surface. Lily reached the edge of the ballroom, where a corridor opened toward the private lounge, a quieter space designed for closed conversations and controlled outcomes. And for a moment she slowed, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing what came next with the same calm precision she had carried through the entire evening. A staff member near the entrance straightened instinctively as she approached, offering a polite nod, unaware of the significance of the moment, but responding to something in her presence that felt undeniable, something that did not ask for recognition, but received it anyway. Inside the lounge, the noise of the ballroom softened into a distant hum, the lighting warmer, the atmosphere contained, and for the first time that night, Lily allowed herself a breath that was not measured for anyone else, a breath that belonged entirely to her. She moved toward a small table near the window, resting her hand briefly against the back of a chair, grounding herself again, not out of weakness, but out of awareness, because every step from here forward mattered in ways no one else in that building could fully understand yet. Her reflection in the glass returned, clearer now without the crowd behind it, and she studied it for a second, not searching for reassurance, not questioning, just acknowledging the person who stood there, steady, present, unchanged in ways that mattered most. Her hand moved gently to her abdomen, feeling the quiet reminder beneath her palm, a subtle movement that anchored her more than any thought could, and in that moment, the decision she had already made settled into something solid, something that did not require explanation or approval. A phone vibrated softly against the table, the sound barely audible, but enough to shift her attention, and she reached for it without urgency, her movements unhurried, controlled, as if time itself had adjusted to her pace rather than the other way around. The screen lit up with a single message, short, direct, carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested, and as her eyes moved across the words, nothing in her expression changed, not surprise, not relief, just recognition, as if this had always been part of the path she was walking. Outside the lounge, the ballroom continued its performance. The music, the conversations, the carefully maintained illusion of continuity. But inside, something far more real had begun to take shape, something quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. Lily placed the phone back down with the same calm precision, her gaze returning to the reflection in the glass. And for the first time since the evening began, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not a smile, not quite, but something close to certainty, the kind that does not come from reacting to a moment, but from understanding exactly where that moment is leading. And somewhere beyond the walls of that building, beyond the lights and the expectations and the carefully constructed narratives, the next part of the story was already moving into place, waiting, not for permission, but for her to step into it. She did not pick the phone up again right away, and that restraint, that deliberate pause, mattered more than the message itself, because it showed she was no longer reacting, no longer chasing, no longer waiting for anyone else to define the timing of her decisions. Outside, the faint echo of laughter drifted through the corridor, slightly forced, slightly louder than it needed to be. The kind of sound people make when they are trying to prove something has not changed, even when they know it has. Lily rested her fingers lightly against the edge of the table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her hand, grounding herself not in the room, not in the night, but in the clarity that had settled inside her, steady and unmoving. The phone remained still beside her, its screen now dark, but the words it had carried lingered, not as a surprise, not as a disruption, but as confirmation, as alignment with something she had already begun. A quiet knock sounded at the lounge entrance, soft, respectful, and when the door opened, a man stepped inside with measured confidence, dressed in a dark suit that carried the understated precision of someone who did not need to announce his position to be recognized. He paused just inside the doorway, not approaching immediately, not interrupting, simply allowing the space to acknowledge his presence, and Lily did not turn right away, as if she already knew who had entered, as if this moment had been expected long before it arrived. When she finally looked over her shoulder, their eyes met. With a familiarity that did not need introduction, not warm, not distant, just understood, and the silence between them held no tension, only purpose. He moved closer then, each step quiet, controlled, stopping at a respectful distance from her, his posture composed, his gaze steady, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm certainty she had embodied all evening. "Everything is ready," he said, not asking, not explaining, just stating a fact that fit seamlessly into the path already unfolding. Lily studied him for a moment, not questioning, not hesitating, just confirming what she already knew, and then she gave the slightest nod, a gesture so small it could be missed by anyone not paying attention. But in that nod was an entire decision, complete and irreversible. Behind the closed doors, the ballroom continued its careful illusion, the music rising, the conversations weaving, the performance holding just enough to keep appearances intact, but the reality had already shifted beyond those walls, moving quietly, deliberately, into something far more precise. The man reached into his jacket and placed a slim folder on the table, the motion smooth, practiced, and Lily's gaze dropped to it briefly, not with urgency, not with curiosity, but with recognition, because this was not new information, this was simply the next step. She did not open it immediately, did not rush to reveal what was inside, because the power of it did not come from the moment of exposure. It came from the timing, and she understood timing better than anyone in that building now. Instead, she placed her hand gently over the folder, her fingers resting there as if claiming it, as if anchoring the next phase of what had already begun, and in that quiet gesture, something settled completely into place. The man remained still, waiting, not for instruction, but for confirmation. And when Lily finally lifted her gaze back to him, there was no uncertainty left, no hesitation, only clarity, the kind that does not waver once it has been reached. Outside, a burst of applause rose suddenly, sharp and bright, as if the evening had found its rhythm again, as if nothing had been disrupted, but inside the lounge, the truth moved on a different timeline, one that did not depend on perception or performance. Lily picked up the phone at last, her movements unhurried, and as she unlocked the screen, her reflection caught in the glass once more, steady, composed, unchanged, and this time, when she looked at it, there was no question of what came next, only the quiet certainty that it had already begun. The screen lit up softly in her hand, casting a faint glow against her fingers, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to narrow down to that single point of light, Because what came next would not be loud, would not be dramatic, but it would be undeniable. Lily scrolled once, slow, deliberate, her eyes moving with quiet precision across the message thread, confirming details that had already been set in motion hours before anyone arrived at the ballroom. And as she paused, her reflection in the glass aligned perfectly with the version of herself she had already stepped into, composed, certain, no longer waiting for anything outside her control. The man across from her remained still, his presence steady, not pressing, not questioning, simply there as part of the structure that had been built quietly in the background, a structure that did not rely on spectacle but on timing, accuracy, and inevitability. Outside, the applause faded into another swell of music, something brighter. Now, almost celebratory, as if the evening had found a new rhythm. But inside the lounge, the silence carried a different energy, focused, intentional, like the calm before a shift that could not be reversed. Lily tapped the screen once, sending a single response, brief, direct, and final, and as the message delivered, a subtle change moved through her posture, not visible to anyone who did not know what to look for, but real enough to mark the moment. The man gave a slight nod, not in approval, not in surprise, just acknowledgement, as if the next phase had officially begun, and he reached for the folder on the table, opening it with careful precision, revealing documents arranged with exact clarity, each page aligned, each detail accounted for, nothing left to interpretation. Lily's gaze lowered to the contents, not scanning, not searching, just confirming, because she already knew what was there, and the power of it did not come from discovery. It came from execution. A soft vibration echoed from the phone again. This time not a message but a notification, one that carried the quiet weight of movement beyond the walls of the building. And as she glanced at it, her expression remained unchanged, because this too was expected, part of the sequence, part of the timing. Outside the lounge, the ballroom doors opened briefly, and a burst of light and sound spilled into the corridor, a reminder that the performance continued uninterrupted, that from the outside, everything still appeared exactly as it should, but inside, the narrative had already shifted into something far more precise. The man closed the folder again, his movements efficient, controlled, and he placed it back in front of her, waiting, not for instruction, but for the final confirmation that everything would proceed exactly as planned. Lily rested her hand on top of it once more, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, and in that simple gesture, she made it clear that there would be no deviation, no hesitation, no reconsideration. She stood then, slowly, deliberately, the movement smooth despite the weight she carried, and as she straightened, the room seemed to adjust around her, not because anything physically changed, but because her presence now carried a different gravity, one that did not ask for attention but commanded it without effort. The man stepped back slightly, giving her space, and as she turned toward the door, her reflection caught in the glass one last time, clear, composed, undeniable. Beyond that door, the lights were brighter, the music louder, the expectations sharper, but none of that held the same power it had before, because the outcome was no longer uncertain. Lily reached for the handle, her fingers closing around it with quiet certainty, and for a fraction of a second, everything stilled again, not in hesitation, but in precision, the exact moment before action becomes reality, the exact moment where intention becomes consequence. And then she opened the door, stepping back into the light, carrying with her something no one in that ballroom was prepared to face, not yet, but very soon. The ballroom did not stop when she returned, but it shifted, subtle at first, like a current changing direction beneath still water, and the moment Lily stepped back into the light, something in the atmosphere recognized it before the people did. The music continued, bright and polished, conversations carried on in measured tones, but eyes followed her now, not openly, not directly, just enough to register that the center of gravity had moved. Ethan noticed it immediately, not because he was watching her, but because he was watching the room, and the room was watching her. He turned just as she reached the edge of the dance floor, his expression composed, controlled, but the timing was no longer his, the rhythm no longer predictable, and for the first time that evening, he adjusted not out of choice, but out of necessity. Vanessa followed his gaze, her posture still confident, her expression still composed. But even she could not ignore the shift, the way attention no longer aligned with expectation, the way presence had begun to outweigh position. Lily did not stop in the shadows, did not remain at the edge. She moved forward, steady, deliberate, each step quiet but unmistakable. And as she approached the center of the room, the conversations nearest to her softened, then paused, then dissolved into something quieter, something more attentive. A host near the stage hesitated, his hand hovering over the microphone as if unsure whether to continue or step back. Because moments like this did not belong to scripts or schedules, they belonged to something less controlled, something more real. Lily came to a stop where the light was strongest, where every reflection could be seen clearly, and for a brief second, nothing happened, no announcement, no gesture, just stillness, the kind that draws every eye without asking for it. Ethan moved toward her then, his steps measured, his presence reclaiming space out of instinct, and when he reached her, he lowered his voice just enough to keep the moment contained, or so he believed. "This is unnecessary," he said, calm, firm, the tone of a man accustomed to closing conversations before they begin. But Lily did not respond to the tone, did not adjust to the expectation. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and in that look, something unspoken passed between them, something that made his next words pause before they formed. Around them, the room held its breath again, not in shock this time, but in anticipation, because the shift was no longer subtle. It was present, undeniable, and it was happening in real time. Lily reached into her hand, not for emphasis, not for display, but with quiet intention, and when she lifted the slim folder slightly, just enough for it to exist within the space between them, it changed everything without a single word being spoken. Ethan's gaze dropped to it for a fraction of a second, just long enough to recognize its significance. And when he looked back up, the certainty in his expression had altered, not gone, but no longer absolute. Vanessa took a small step closer, her composure intact, but her attention sharper now, more focused, as if recalculating her place within a moment that was no longer predictable. Lily did not open the folder, did not reveal its contents, because the power of it did not lie in exposure. It lay in the fact that it existed at all, here, now, in a space that had not been designed for truth. She held it there for a moment longer, just enough for the message to settle, just enough for the balance to shift completely, and then she lowered it again, her movements calm, controlled, final. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of understanding, of realization, of something irreversible taking shape beneath the surface. Ethan straightened slightly, his posture adjusting, his mind moving through possibilities, outcomes, contingencies, but the framework he relied on had already changed, and he knew it. Lily met his gaze one last time, not with challenge, not with emotion, just with clarity, and then she turned, not away in retreat, but away in completion, because the moment she had stepped into had already reached its conclusion. Behind her, the room began to move again, slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, conversations returning, music filling the space, the performance resuming. But it was different now, altered in a way that could not be undone, because everyone had seen it, everyone had felt it, and even if no one spoke of it, they would remember. And as Lily walked forward, steady, composed, carrying nothing visible except her certainty, the truth moved with her, quiet, precise, and unstoppable, already unfolding into consequences that no one in that ballroom would be able to ignore for much longer.